please come here. Рэймонд Курцвейл, изобретатель, футуролог, автор концепции технологической сингулярности, первый разработчик первого планшетного сканера, человек, который создал систему распознавания текста и синтеза звука, человек, который введен в Национальный зал славы изобретателей США. Рэймонд, it's not your biography, it's just a brief introduction into it. So, if you have a look in here, it's your countdown. Здесь у всех выступающих будет обратный отсчет. It's your time now.
It's a pleasure. How's that? Well, hear me? It's a pleasure to be with you, and exciting to have a Congress like this, particularly here in Moscow. It's my first trip, but I'm delighted to be here. I went to a school named MIT in the Boston area. It's a leading technology school in the United States. I actually went there because MIT was so advanced in 1965 that it actually had a computer. Most schools didn't have one. This computer I carry around is actually several billion times more powerful per dollar or per ruble than that computer. It's a million times cheaper. It's several thousand times more powerful. And that's typical of information technology. I'm probably the only person you'll ever meet who has a dual degree from MIT in computer science and creative writing, because that was very unusual. In fact, there were very few people who majored in creative writing or literature at MIT. Half of the authors we studied were Russian authors, particularly from the 19th century, but also some modern ones. And a lot of the mathematicians that we studied in computer science were also Russian, like, for example, Markov, in the late 19th century, created a theory of Markov chains and hidden Markov models. That is actually the #1 method or algorithm used in artificial intelligence today. I began using them in speech recognition in the early 1980s, and then we applied them to natural language understanding. There was recently an IBM computer that won the Jeopardy game, which is a game in English. I don't know if there's a Russian equivalent, but it's a language game. It's a popular television show. And the computer was able to defeat the best 2 human Jeopardy players. Those models are largely based on Markov models. And I'm writing a book on the brain now, and I have a theory as to how the neocortex works. And there's basically one module that recognizes a pattern, and that is repeated 300 million times by my estimate. And they're organized in hierarchies. So at the very bottom, you have little recognizers that recognize, the little parts of letter shapes, a crossbar and a capital A and so on. At a high level, you have recognition of things like humor and irony, jealousy. They're actually the same pattern recognizers, but they exist at different levels in the conceptual hierarchy. And this very complex wiring we see in the neocortex, which is 80% of the human brain, that's where we do our thinking, is not actually, doesn't come pre-designed. That is actually wired by these little modules themselves based on what they learn. So depending on what you actually think about and learn, it's actually creating wiring to generate this elaborate hierarchy of patterns. And it enables us to actually understand information in a hierarchical fashion. And the world is inherently made up of hierarchies. We have forests, which are made up of trees, and trees are made up of branches, and branches are made up of little branches, and little branches are made up of leaves, and so on. There's a natural hierarchy to the world. We have a neocortex that can understand that. Only mammals have that. And in my book, I describe actually the method, the algorithm that's used by these 300 million pattern recognizers. So people actually looked up on Google. There's 4 million quotations on Google saying how incredibly complex the human brain is. But this book I'm writing is not adding to that collection of quotations. I really explain a fairly simple approach, relatively simple, that is repeated 300 million times. It's able to self-organize into these elaborate hierarchies. So by the time you get to be our age and you've experienced life, the neocortex is complex, but it actually starts out fairly simple. This method actually turns out to be what are called hidden Markov models, which was invented or discovered by this Russian mathematician in the late 19th century. So this is all an elaborate way of saying I'm happy to be here in Moscow and in Russia, where there is a great tradition of learning, both in culture and science and math. And I think that positions Russia very well for the future world, because the future world is going to be based on creating new knowledge. And one of the things that children need in order to enter that world is an appreciation of the knowledge of the past, and also an awareness of that knowledge, so that we can build future knowledge. I was asked yesterday, we had a panel, what would I recommend for Russian education? It's really the same thing that I recommend everywhere, all throughout the world. It's certainly true in my country, in the United States. We have an educational system that's still based on the 19th century, which is teaching kids a lot of knowledge and information. Some of that is useful so that we can appreciate the cultural foundation that we inherit from the past. We can't create the future without it. But we really do carry our knowledge with us. We can access all of human knowledge with a few keystrokes. In Africa, with a smartphone, has access to more knowledge than the president of the United States or Russia did 15 years ago. These are very powerful tools. What we really need to teach children is how to create new knowledge. And the best way to do that is actually doing their own projects. And this is a mission that I have, to bring this kind of entrepreneurial spirit, a spirit of actually learning by doing, into the schools. I started a university called Singularity University. It's, I co-founded it with Peter Diamandis of the X Prize Foundation. It's backed by Google. NASA, the American Space Agency, provided us a campus in Silicon Valley in California. We have about 60 faculty, and we have 80 students from all around the world, including Russia. And half of the curriculum is actually doing projects. These students self-organize into teams. They take on some world challenge, hunger, availability of water, applying three-dimensional printing to printing out modules to create new housing, and actually invent technologies of the future. And those projects may very well work out and change the world. Even if they don't, it's really the best way to learn. You know, what I remember from my youth and from my education is really from my own projects, because I've been doing projects since I was 5. It's really the best way to learn. We should bring that spirit of learning by doing into high schools, junior high schools, elementary schools. And I think we have an outstanding foundation here in Russia. But I will say that it's really one world now. I happen to be traveling around the world in October of 2008 when the current financial crisis started, the current worldwide recession. And literally within 1 week, every industry in every country, I happen to be on 5 different continents that month, was suddenly affected. So it's not just a poetic sentiment that we're all connected. It really is one world economy. It's increasingly one world culture with many traditions feeding into it. A country like Russia or the United States are not islands. People ask me in the United States, well, how is the United States going to compete with emerging countries like China. And, you know, it's really not a zero-sum game. An engineer in Russia or China or Africa creates, let's say, a breakthrough in solar panels. That benefits everyone. It's one world economy. But education, particularly learning by doing, I think is a key to the future. It was alluded to earlier that the pace of change is getting faster and faster. That's something that I've studied and that I'm going to talk to you about. I happened to give a speech on the 500th anniversary of the University of Basel about a year ago. And this university was started 20 years after Gutenberg invented the printing press, not too far away from where he made that invention. I said, wow, that's exciting. You must have had some of Gutenberg's books when you opened your doors in something like 1440. And they said, yes, we got them very quickly. It was only 100 years later. And that is how technology moved in those days. It actually took 400 years for the printing press to reach a large audience. The telephone did that. It reached a quarter of the population in the United States, Europe, and Russia in about 50 years. Cell phones did that in about 7 years. Social networks, wikis, blogs, some other recent technologies have done that in 3 years. So the pace of change is getting faster and faster. And what's driving that is what I call the law of accelerating returns, which is the exponential growth of information technology. Now, the way I encountered that, I decided I wanted to be an inventor when I was 5, as I mentioned. And I realized 30 years ago, 1981, I started to think about the fact that if I looked around at the inventors who were successful, their timing was perfect. They did things at exactly the right time. Turns out that timing is important for just about anything, whether it's a business investment or romance. You got to be in the right place at the right time. And most inventors actually get their projects to work, but usually inventors are too early or they're too late. So I wanted to study technology trends. Could I anticipate where the world would be by the time I finished the project? If a project takes, let's say, 3 or 4 years, it will be a different world 3 or 4 years later. That's certainly true today, but it was also true in 1981. So I started to think, you know, you can't shoot it at the target where it is. It's like skeet shooting. You have to figure out where it's going to be. Can I anticipate where technology would be? And so being an engineer, I gathered a lot of data. I did not expect really to find anything very predictable. The common wisdom was, and still in most quarters is, that you cannot predict the future. The future is unpredictable. And there's certainly many good examples of people who have made bad predictions in the past about the future. But I made a very surprising discovery. If you measure the underlying properties of information technology, for example, the power of computers per unit currency, instructions per second per constant dollar, for example, or the number of bits we're moving around wirelessly in the whole world, or the number of base pairs of DNA we're sequencing. And I could mention 100 other measures like that. They follow very predictable trajectories. And what that predictable trajectory is an exponential progression. It basically doubles every period of time. That doubling time actually itself gets faster and faster. The world of computation, of computers, started with the collection of the United States Census in 1890. It's been growing exponentially ever since. The power of computers for the same price doubled every 3 years, around 1900, every 2 years around 1950. It was 12 months in the year 2000. It's now down to 11 months. But it's a very smooth, a very predictable exponential trajectory. So I had this curve, and I'll show it to you, up through 1980 and 1981. I continued the curve through 2050, and now we're at 2012, and we're exactly right on that curve. the power of computation has continued to flow exactly on that curve. And so not only is it predictable, well, what's predictable is that it grows exponentially, and exponentials are very surprising. They're also not our intuition. We have an intuition about the future. The reason we have a brain is, in fact, to predict the future. That's why we have intelligence. So when I walked through the fields 1,000 years ago, I would be walking and say, okay, there's an animal going that way, I'm going this way, and I'd make a prediction, we're going to cross paths in about 2 minutes, I'm going to go this other way. And that turned out to be good for survival. And I was making a prediction about where I would be, where the animal would be, and then made a decision. That's why intelligence is useful. Those predictions about the future, though, are linear. I assumed I was going to just keep going at the same speed. I assumed the animal was going to do the same thing. That actually is correct, and that works out quite well when it comes to the kinds of problems we needed to solve 1,000 years ago. Turns out to be very inaccurate when it comes to predicting the future of information technology. Not any technology. In fact, technologies, before they become information technologies, progress linearly, like health and medicine. I'll talk about that in a moment. But once it becomes an information technology, it progresses exponentially, and that's not our intuition. So one of the differences between my own predictions, and I now have a 30-year track record, which have been very accurate, and my critics, is that they're using their intuition, which is hardwired in our brains, which is a linear prediction of the future, but it's simply not accurate when it comes to information technology. Now you might think, well, what difference does it make? Is it really that different between a linear and an exponential projection? Well, it doesn't make much difference in the short term. It makes a huge difference in the long term. If you look at most models that governments use, for example, to predict the future, in the United States we have debates about Social Security, which is our old age retirement plan for the nation, and the predictions that in 27 years it'll run out of money. They're all based on linear predictions of the future. Those linear predictions work actually quite well for a year or two. They're totally ridiculous when it comes to 10 or 20 years. If I take 30 steps linearly, that's our intuition about the future. 1, 2, 3, 4. At step 30, I'm at 30. If I take 30 steps exponentially, 2, 4, 8, 16, that is the reality of information technology. I get to 1 billion. It makes a huge difference in the reality of what will happen. And this is not just an idle speculation about the future. As I mentioned, this is several billion times more powerful per dollar or per ruble than the computer that thousands of us shared when I was a student. It's also 100,000 times smaller. That's another exponential projection. And it's and that will continue. In 25 years from now, this will again be 1 billion times more powerful for the same price. It'll be 100,000 times smaller again. It'll be the size of a blood cell, and we really will begin to integrate with them. That's not a completely new phenomenon. There are people walking around today with computers connected into their brains. For example, if you're a Parkinson's patient, or even someone who has a cochlear implant for the deaf, there are computerized organs, like computerized pancreases, that are being implanted in people. So this is already happening. Requires surgery today, but when it becomes the size of a blood cell, we'll just introduce them through the bloodstream, and that's one way in which we will integrate with machines. Now, I want to show you some examples, but before I do, I just want to mention one other thing, which is this exponential growth of information technology, which is ultimately very transformative. It does not just apply to these gadgets we carry around. It ultimately will apply to everything we care about. Take, for example, health and medicine, which didn't used to be an information technology. It was just hit or miss. We would find things that happened to work. Oh, here's something that lowers blood pressure. Here's something that kills the HIV virus. They were discovered accidentally. we would systematically go through 10,000 compounds to find something that worked. It's called drug discovery. That's not an information technology. But with the collection of the genome, which is basically the software of life, we actually now are beginning to treat biology as the information process which it truly is. Genes are little software programs. How long do you go without updating the software on your phone? This is probably updating itself now as I speak. But I have software running in my body which hasn't been updated for thousands of years. And it's not just a metaphor. It's literally true. One of the genes, for example, the fat insulin receptor gene, says hold on to every calorie because the next hunting season may not work out so well. And that was a very good idea 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years ago, there was very little food, and you didn't know when you'd get your next meal, so you would store every calorie in your body so that you could last until the next meal came along. I would like to be able to tell my fat insulin receptor gene, you don't need to do that anymore. And that's exactly what was done in animal experiments. We turned that gene off, and these animals ate an enormous amount and remained slim, and it wasn't a fake slimness. They didn't get diabetes, they didn't get heart disease, they lived 20% longer, they got the benefits of caloric restriction while doing the opposite, and there's pharmaceutical companies rushing to bring that to the human market. I know the scientists who did that. And that's just one example of hundreds of projects where people are turning off or adding new genes. I'm involved with a project where we take cells out of the body, lung cells, add a new gene. This is for people that have a disease called pulmonary hypertension, which is caused by the lack of a certain gene. If you're missing a particular gene, you'll get this disease. The disease typically is fatal within 6 to 12 months. Children at 5 or 6 years old who don't have this gene get this disease and generally don't last more than a year. We took these lung cells out of the body, added the new gene that they were missing, replicated that 1 million-fold, injected back in the body, went through the bloodstream, ended up back in the lungs, and actually cured this disease. And this is...
We've got some problems with the translation. Could you wait just for a while, please, if possible? Будьте добры, проверьте, пожалуйста, не идет перевод на русский язык. Yeah, okay, it's okay now, Рэймонд, sorry.
Okay. Sorry for my lack of Russian. So we added this gene that was missing, replicated these cells, injected it back in the body, went through the bloodstream, and actually cured this disease. And this is now undergoing human trials. So this is just one example of many where we're actually reprogramming biology. Biology is inherently an information process. By the way, the Genome Project itself was a good example of this exponential growth I'm talking about. Halfway through the project, the critics were saying, this isn't working. You've only collected 1% of the genome after 7 years, which is half of the 15 years that was projected. 1%, 7 years, it's going to take 700 years, which is what we said originally. My reaction was, no, it's almost done, because it's an exponential trajectory. It's doubling every year. After 7 years, it had been doubling every time. 1% is only 7 doublings away from 100%. It continued to double every year, and the project was finished on time. And every other aspect of biology has continued to scale up exponentially. Now that we're treating it as an information technology. So these technologies, the ability to reprogram our genes, for example, are in an early stage, but these technologies are going to double in power every year, and they will be 1,000 times more powerful than they are in 10 years. They'll be 1 million times more powerful than they are today in 20 years. and it will be a very different era. So let me show you just a few examples of how this works. I'll skip some of these slides since I've discussed a lot of these issues. Okay, so here's a good example, this graph over here. By the way, these are logarithmic scales, meaning every level on this graph is 1,000 times greater than the level below it. So a straight line is exponential growth. So that line actually represents trillions-fold increase over a century. Trillions-fold in what? This is actually measuring the number of bits we move around wirelessly in the world. So the power of communication technologies, wireless communication. 100 years ago, that was Morse code over AM radio. Today, it's 4G networks. But look at how smooth a trajectory that is. You would think that given all the vagaries of news, headlines, a billion-dollar company goes bankrupt, new products come out, one company takes over from another company, countries accused of dumping products, that this would be very erratic. I mean, look at how smooth a trajectory that is. So let me show you the one that I first discovered, which is this one. This is the power of computers, going back to the 1890 American census. And every level on this is a logarithmic scale. Every level on this graph is 100,000 times greater than the level below it. So this represents trillions-fold increase over, a little over a century. Several billion-fold just since I was an undergraduate. And a lot of people say, well, you can't just take exponentials and project them out indefinitely. Kurzweil takes these exponentials and projects them out, and every exponential comes to an end. Well, in information technology, a particular method will come to an end, but it leads to research pressure to create the next method. Moore's law, which is the shrinking of component sizes on a chip, was not the first paradigm to bring exponential growth to computing. This started decades before Gordon Moore was even born. Chips was the fifth paradigm, not the first. In the 1950s, we were shrinking vacuum tubes, making them smaller and smaller. In 1952, CBS predicted the election of Eisenhower, the American president. First time the American networks did that. Then they were making the vacuum tubes smaller and smaller every year. Finally, they couldn't shrink them anymore and keep the vacuum, and that was the end of the shrinking of vacuum tubes. It was not the end of this exponential growth. It just went to another method, to transistors and finally to chips. But again, look at how smooth a trajectory that is. It's not affected by anything. It was not affected by the Great Depression that swept the world in the 1930s. It was not affected by World War I or World War II or by the Cold War or any of the events of the 20th century or 21st century. People say, well, the recent recession must have slowed it down. No, it's continued without stopping at all through the recent economic problems. And it's really remarkable how smooth a trajectory that is. So I don't want to dwell on these examples of electronics, but up there, the cost of a transistor, you could buy one transistor for $1 in 1968. I remember being in college and being very excited that, wow, I could get a whole transistor for only $1. Today, you can get several billion for $1, and they're actually better because they're smaller, therefore they're faster. The cost of a transistor cycle has come down by half in less than a year. That represents a 50% deflation rate. Economists actually worry about deflation. The concern is that as everything becomes information technology, if you can get the same stuff a year later for half the price, you will buy more. That's an economic reality. But you're not going to double your consumption. So therefore, the size of the economy, as measured in rubles or dollars, will shrink. And for actually a variety of good reasons, that would not be a good thing. That's actually not what we see. This is bits of memory shipped, but I could show you 50 other graphs like this. We actually more than double our consumption every year. Because as price performance reaches certain levels, whole new applications explode. People didn't buy iPods for $10,000 each, which is what it would have cost 15 years ago. When the price performance is there, whole new capabilities, search engines, fax machines, digital cameras, social networks take off. And that's actually represents 18% growth in constant currency, even though we can get twice as much capability each year for the same price. So I mentioned the biotechnology revolution. This is, again, a very smooth doubling every year. The cost has come down by half every year, and many other aspects of biology are also scaling up in this exponential manner. Communication technologies. This little graph here I had in the early 80s. I had just a few points on that graph, and I projected out what I said would be a worldwide web of communications connecting hundreds of millions of people around the world to each other and to vast knowledge resources emerging by the late 90s. And people thought that was crazy when in the early 80s the entire American defense budget could only tie together 2,000 scientists together. But that's the power of exponential growth. That's what happened. This graph on the right is the same data but seen on a linear scale rather than a logarithmic scale. So it's the same information, but it looks like to the casual observer that the World Wide Web came out of nowhere in the mid-1990s. But you could see it coming if you looked at this exponential trajectory. We're shrinking technology. I mentioned that this computer in my pocket is 100,000 times smaller than the one I used as a student. We can now actually manufacture things just from information using three-dimensional printers and very inexpensive input materials. So if I want to send you a book or a music album or a movie, I can send you an email attachment and you can read a book or a movie or a sound recording. But I can also send you a violin. And if you have a three-dimensional printer, you can print it out. Now, three-dimensional printers have been expensive. They've just a few years ago cost tens of thousands of dollars, and now in the thousands of dollars. There are a few recent announcements that they're in hundreds of dollars. I'm not sure those are real, but it's coming down in price. The scale of precision is getting finer and finer at an exponential pace. Right now it's in microns, millions of a meter. It will be in billions of a meter, nanometers, which will be true nanotechnology within 20 years. But that's not an artist's conception. That's an actual picture of a violin that was printed out on a three-dimensional printer. Somebody printed out an airplane in modules and snapped them together and flew in it on a three-dimensional printer. Today, with your three-dimensional printer, you can print out 70% of the parts you need to build another three-dimensional printer. And that'll be 100% within 10 years. So ultimately, this is going to revolutionize manufacturing. We ultimately will be able to print out clothes. You can have your avatar in your three-dimensional virtual reality environment and then dress it with different fashions and then actually print out the clothes right on your desktop three-dimensional printer. This is going to revolutionize manufacturing, which is why I say that the future is not in manufacturing jobs. In fact, already in the United States, for example, 1/3 of the population worked in factories in 1900. It's down to 3% today. It's really going to be in creating the intellectual property and the intellect that goes into all of these industries. This is actually where 2045 comes from. This is a cover story in the American magazine Time magazine about this idea, my idea of the law of accelerating returns. They wanted to print that graph, and they said, hey, we want you to put this one computer on it that we covered a few weeks ago. So we put it on there, and it's right on the curve. This is a curve that I laid out in 1981, and it's still exactly correct in terms of the power of computation. and it's an exponential graph. So this represents exponential growth that's going to continue well into the future. The last important area I want to cover, because I want to leave some time for questions, is on the brain. I've been thinking for 50 years, and I'm writing a book that's coming out actually this fall called How to Create a Mind, The Secret of Human Thought Revealed. It really describes what I mentioned earlier, which is this key algorithm in the neocortex that's repeated 300 million times, and it's self-organizing, and that the connections from one conceptual level to the next are made by these modules themselves. So not only does our brain create our thoughts, but our thoughts actually create our brain, quite literally, and we can actually see this now. And this is all scaling up exponentially. There are many different projects, like the Blue Brain Project, to simulate the neocortex. And this one system, Watson, which can actually deal very intelligently with human language, is able to deal with questions in Jeopardy, which are very subtle uses of language, using humor and puns and metaphors, and requires accessing all of human knowledge. And this system actually read in natural language all of Wikipedia in English, and several other encyclopedias. It actually read 200 million pages and mastered it all, and can come up with any information from those 200 million pages within 3 seconds. And it's based on models that are very similar to what I'm describing. Markov models, actually, or the mathematical equivalent. But this is a simulation of a slice of the neocortex. All of this is scaling up at an exponential pace. There are working simulations of the human auditory cortex, where we process sound, the visual cortex, the cerebellum, where we do our skill formation. For example, catching a fly ball. A kid does that without thinking about it, although she has to learn how to do it. I've always wondered, how does that work? A child is seeing the ball go up in the air and then moves her hand and catches the ball. In order to do that, you have to solve a dozen simultaneous differential equations in 2 seconds. And most 10-year-olds haven't taken calculus. So we wondered how that worked. The cerebellum actually solves those equations. That's how it works. And we've actually figured that out. And there are working models and simulations of the cerebellum. So let me address one more thing, and then we will have time for questions, which is this a good thing or a bad thing? There's actually a very popular or influential public perception or movement that the world is getting worse, that the world is getting more violent, the poor are getting poorer, the environment is getting worse, the world in general is getting poorer. Turns out not to be the case. I have 50 different graphs like this, which and I'll show you this one just to make the point. The world's actually getting better. The reason we think the world's getting worse is we have much better information about what's wrong with the world. So if there's a battle in Fallujah, it's not far away. It's right, we're there. It's right on our palm tops. We experience it. So when there are problems with poverty or health or conflict or war somewhere in the world, we hear about it, and very often we can't solve it right away, so we're frustrated because we're empathetic creatures, and we want to solve problems that we hear about. And so people get frustrated and think things are getting worse. It's not like these problems didn't exist. In fact, they were much worse. There's a recent book by Steven Pinker that actually human conflict and violence has been steadily coming down, despite all appearances, because you hear about violence all the time, but actually there's much less of it in the world than there's ever been. The world is healthier. Human longevity was 20 1,000 years ago. It was 37 in 1800. It's now pushing 80. So this graph, it's a moving graph. This is 1800, and these are all countries. The big red circle is China. Actually, watch China because it does some interesting things. And this is on two different scales. On the x-axis, it's the wealth of nations, income per person, actually GDP per capita. And it was in the hundreds of dollars on average in 1800. On the y-axis, it's life expectancy, which was in the 20s and 30s, depending on where you were. Average, worldwide average, 37. So let's see what happened. This is now the early industrial revolution. A few countries are experimenting with new industry and are making some progress. China's bouncing around. And as we get to the 20th century, this picks up pace, and while there is a have-not divide, a gap, there's a wind that carries all of these nations towards the upper right-hand corner of the graph, towards greater longevity and greater wealth. And this is not stopping, it's not slowing down. Here's a snapshot of 2009, but this is going to continue. In fact, it's going to go into even higher gear because of this acceleration of the pace of change, this ongoing exponential growth of information technology, the greater purview of information technology and its influence on everything. So there's still a divide. The rich nations are still better off than the poor nations, but the poorest nations in the world are actually much better off than the richest nations were at the beginning of this process. So I'll show you one last, well, let me show you two couple things. People say, well, you know, if we live longer, we're going to run out of resources. We're already running out of energy, and it's not true. We're running out of energy only if we limit ourselves to 19th century technologies. For example, solar energy, we have 10,000 times more sunlight than we need to meet 100% of our energy needs. In other words, we only have to capture 1 part in 10,000 of the sunlight falling on the Earth to meet all of our energy needs. The cost per watt of solar energy on this graph here is coming down very quickly. As a result, the total amount of solar energy backwards here, but it's not cooperating. Anyway, I had a graph showing smooth exponential growth of the total amount of solar energy. For the last 25 years, it has doubled every 2 years. Very smooth exponential growth, doubling every 2 years. And it's only 7 doublings away from meeting 100% of the world's energy needs, which means that right now it's meeting 1% of the world's energy needs. So people say 1%, that's insignificant, it's a fringe player, they dismiss it, but they ignore this exponential growth, which is the same thing we did with the internet or with the Genome Project. But it's only 7 doublings at 2 years each to meet 100% of our energy needs. And there are many other exponentially growing energy technologies as well. There's similar stories for clean water, for food, that are coming from new technologies.
Рэймонд, let me just remind you that in this country, in Moscow, the way to the airport takes twice more time every year. Don't be late, I mean.
So here is the progress we've made. Here's the progress we've made on longevity so far. This is when health and medicine was not an information technology. It was hit or miss, but it was still very useful. And this is going to go into high gear now that health and medicine has become an information technology, and we have the means of literally reprogramming our biology away from disease and away from aging. And many of these technologies are really gaining fruition. There was just, the day before yesterday, a major announcement that if you have a heart attack, if you had a heart attack, half of the survivors have a damaged heart and are therefore very weak. My father had this condition, he could hardly walk. You can now get that fixed with stem cell therapies that actually regrow your heart. That's just one example. We're going to be able to regrow every organ in the body to be younger and free of disease. So hang in there. It'll be, I think, a very interesting future for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Raymond. It was really, really impressive. И меня очень лично впечатляет то, что я не знаю, как этот человек успеет на свой самолет. So my idea, just 2 questions and 5 minutes of limit. Raymond, will it be on time? 2 questions and 5 minutes. У нас, к сожалению, лимит 5 минут и 2 вопроса. Я готов предоставить микрофон. Да, прошу, не забывайте, пожалуйста, представляться.
Добрый день, буду короток. Константин Курилов, Калининград. Но у меня личный вопрос такой, потому что приезд такого феноменального человека в Россию необычен. Скажите, Рэй, как выглядит ваш рацион питания?
И сокращается ли он каждые 10 лет?
I've actually written 3 health books. The last 2 are with a medical doctor. And we talk about 3 bridges to radical life extension. And bridge 1 is what you can do right now, based on today's knowledge. Bridge 2 is what I was talking about when we get really to the mature phase of the biotechnology revolution. Phase 3 is nanotechnology, for example, blood cell-sized devices that can go inside the bloodstream and keep you healthy from inside. That will really provide very dramatic extensions to human longevity. So the goal right now is actually to get to these future points in good shape, alive and doing well. So you don't have to deploy today's methods to live hundreds of years. You just have to get to, actually by our estimate, 15 years from now will be the mature part of the biotechnology revolution. So a lot of these books that I've written are about how to do that, what to practice today. And it involves there's nothing faddish about it. It's eating healthy fats rather than unhealthy fats. So healthy fats, for example, are omega-3 anti-inflammatory fats, or extra virgin olive oil, which is a monounsaturated fat. Unhealthy fats are eating too much meat products. For example, eating healthy carbs like vegetables and legumes, fruits to some extent, avoiding unhealthy carbs like sodas and pastries. So I follow these kinds of recommendations. I take quite a few supplements to reprogram my biochemistry. I was diagnosed actually with type 2 diabetes 30 years ago, and I completely got rid of it through using this approach, and I've had no indication of type 2 diabetes because of my own diet. I also inherited my father's disposition to heart disease, but I don't have heart disease, again, because of this diet. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. It depends on what your issues are. If you are a person like myself, I'm 64, although I come out younger on biological aging tests, and I have some genes that are not healthy that dispose me to type 2 diabetes or heart disease, then there's actually a fair amount that you need to do, which I do, and I'm able to stay healthy. If you're a 25-year-old without any health problems, and there's not a lot you need to do other than wear your seatbelt and eat a reasonably healthy diet.
Идет перевод просто. Александр Самитин, скажите, пожалуйста, мы говорим очень много о технологии, биологии, компьютеры, но можете ли вы что-то сказать про психологические и социальные процессы? Изучали ли вы это и что-нибудь про это, если можно?
Кто будет следующим президентом России?
Well, we certainly can see already dramatic changes in the political process affected by the tremendous increase in social communication. We see that in the United States, we see that everywhere in the world. This social communication where everybody can communicate with one another is very democratizing, not just politically, but in many other spheres of society. 25 years ago, you went to the doctor was really commanded all of the knowledge in medicine. Now, if a woman has a chronic disease and goes to her doctor, she's in touch with millions of people around the world who have the same condition and absolutely knows everything going on, the latest research, and may very well know more than her doctor does. In fact, we have decision-making, not only decision-making, but actually problem-solving, where groups of, for example, patients are getting together, hundreds of thousands of patients, and actually saying, hey, we have the skills to solve this problem, and we have the motivation, and they are doing collaborative decision-making. So this communication is having a positive effect. Sometimes it's called the wisdom of crowds, that you can take 1,000 people or 1,000,000 people, and if you harness their collective wisdom in the right way, you can get much wiser decisions than even if you pick the wisest person in that group. So I think we actually are making better decisions, solving problems more effectively because of this social communication.
Рэймонд, thank you so much, really.